It's about that time, James. Training camp is right around the corner. Let's get into some of the biggest questions facing the Cincinnati Bengals in this year's camp.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Lisco. He's your host, James Rapien. You can subscribe to this podcast on YouTube or anywhere you get your podcasts. And if you do, you'll be notified, of course, as the platforms do when we upload our content every day. So you can join that first listen club, make us your first listen on the way to work, or become an everydayer that much easier. You'll get a shout out just like those two groups do at the top of every episode. And James, today we're diving into training camp in a little bit more focus. We've talked about it in tangents. We've talked about it as something that's coming in the future, all off season, because it really is that landmark that shifts you from off season mode back to football is here. We're talking about this season in earnest. And last week when we did our mailbag, Tony Lunt at Admiral Taskbar sent in a question. Shout out Tony, that fits for really a whole episode. And this is why I said sometimes these questions turn into entire episodes, right? Which is essentially, what are the biggest questions for training camp that will be answered before, during, and after is the way Tony phrased it. But really the question comes down to, what are the biggest questions we have that we're going to be really focused on from a storyline perspective, and what might those answers be? And that's how we're going to spend today's show.
Yeah, in there are some questions certainly that we'll get to, but I think if you look at all 32 NFL rosters, this Bengals team has the littlest, the smallest amount of them, the shortest list of questions or things that are potential weaknesses, at least right now. And I think that's a heck of a spot to be in. But yeah, no roster is perfect, even this time of year when everyone's optimistic. And the Bengals are no different. So I think naturally we should start with the offensive line, unless there's something else, other questions that you have on tap, because we could go a lot of routes with this, whether it's on the field or the off the field and the business side.
Yeah, I just was going to say that you made a good point about the type of questions we're talking about this year. We know most of these answers and most of the stuff we're talking about is on the margins of what matters to NFL success rather than the core thing. Like, we're not asking a question, for example, that would shape a franchise's season, like who's going to win the quarterback battle? Will Kenny Pickett start right away? Which was a question the Steelers were asking last year in training camp, perhaps, although I think they were pretty married to Mitchell Trubisky at the start of the year. So we're not answering huge questions like that. And in terms of the biggest questions that we're expecting to be answered before camp, Joe Mixon was one. That one now has been answered. We're not waiting for that answer anymore. I think the other one is the extension stuff, and we're going to be watching those, I think, throughout training camp as well. And just as far as Tony's question that we're not going to spend a ton of time on today, we'll talk about it more later in camp, is the questions that will be answered after camp, of course, are things like waiver claims, and those questions will become more clear throughout camp as we get an idea of, where injuries may or may not occur. And hopefully it's none, right? You're always hoping to get out of camp as healthy as possible, and where deficiencies start to show up, where as camp goes on, you're like, this thing didn't quite develop as we hoped it would. And some of these are things we're going to talk about today, but certainly the offensive line, I think, is a question. And how does this unit fit together with new tackles or tackles playing in new positions in the case of Orlando Brown and likely Jonah Williams? Because unless Lyle Collins surprises us and shows up healthier than we think he will for training camp and is ready to go, the competition at right tackle, as far as camp goes, I'm not sure is going to be much of a competition. We'll see how it all shakes out. I think that there will be opportunities, certainly, if Jonah Williams really struggles with that transition to the other side. But to me, a bigger point of interest with the offensive line is how does this group with two new tackles fit together? How does Cordell Volson develop? And how does this offensive line on the whole look when pads come on and in that first preseason game when they go, if they play, I guess, when they go against real competition?
They ain't playing. I'll break the news. They're not playing.
You think that the starting offense isn't? Joe Burrow really wanted to play last year.
Don't care.
Or 2 years ago.
That doesn't
no?
change.
Okay.
Zero chance. I would be shocked. Yeah,
All right.
but I would be. I think they get
not even one series.
If the over-under for total preseason snaps for the starting offense is Joe Burrow's number 9, I will take the under.
Well, what if it's 3?
Oh, I think they'll do a series. It won't be August 12th or whatever it is, though.
Yeah, not the first game necessarily, but
yeah, but I think they get one series total.
Yeah, that's all I'm saying. One series.
Yeah. And actually, I take it back. One set of downs, just to be very clear. So I think it's 3.
Pull them even if they get a first down.
Yeah, that was the plan the last time Joe Burrow played in the preseason.
I guess so. Coming off the ACL, a little bit different.
Sounds like it, right? But I think that's just the case in general. I don't think they'll use that to evaluate the back end of the roster. And I don't think that the slow start last year had anything to do with that, especially with health and questions. Think about it. There's questions about Jonah and his health and Lel. And I think that's where I would start with right tackle is Lel going to be good enough to make it a competition at all for him? Because if it's close to prime Lel, he would be the favorite in that competition. That is unrealistic for a variety of reasons. One, last year, even when he was on the field, was not that. There were times when he was effective, no doubt, but he was not that. And then obviously coming off of an ACL, you had it repaired in January. Can he really be expected to be ready to go? I don't think so. And honestly, if you're him, you want to take it slow because Trey Hopkins sped it up and he was never the same and he was out of the league a year later. And it's tough. And I'm not saying they're the same skill level or talent or anything like that. That's not the point, though. It's tough to do. It's tough to come back that quick. And so I would expect him to start the year on the PUP list if I had to guess. And it's purely speculation, even though I've heard his recovery's going well. And so to your point, I know there's a Jackson Carman hive out there, but I agree with you. I think it's Jonah Williams. And really the storyline at right tackle is how does Jonah get used to right tackle? Does he fare well? That'll be what I'm looking for. I know what Orlando Brown Jr. brings. He's the best left tackle Joe Burrow has had. It's the best guy they've had at left tackle since Andrew Whitworth. So I expect a lot of Orlando Brown Jr. And so hopefully we see that early in camp.
Yeah, and how does Jonah handle that transition is definitely a big question, right? Does he make it smoothly? How well does he play early on? Are we still asking questions of this offensive line in 3 weeks from now, when I'm in Cincinnati in early August? Are we looking at this offensive line like, we were talking a big game all offseason. We were confident about these 5 guys, and now something isn't clicking because Jonah really hasn't taken to right tackle. And that's a question that will need to be answered. I think will be answered pretty quickly. And, the position change thing, a lot of people talk about this that have played on the offensive line. For some people, they can make that transition and it's fine and it's smooth and it's easy. And for others, they really are not used to it. And it's a real issue to switch from one side to the other side.
Yeah. And I think he'll be fine because part of when they drafted Jonah Williams was, man, he can play anywhere. And that was just part of it. And they haven't. Partially because their offensive line has been so bad that they just needed him at left tackle and there were no other options. But I think he'll be a solid right tackle. And we'll see. He's got to prove it because if not, Lel at some point will be healthy and will certainly want to be on the field to get those bonuses that are in his contract. So we will see there. But it's a question. And the other part is that Cordell Volson question. Does he take a step? There's certainly guys in that building and in that locker room that think he does. And if so, this offensive line, and we'll dive more into the offense this week, but this offensive line should be much, much improved.
Yeah, narrowing the gap certainly between where they are and the top of the league, getting closer to average, above average the last couple of years. Seems like they're taking steps in that direction. And last year when they were healthy, they were a solid unit. It wasn't perfect, but it was at least solid. And some other things that'll be interesting to watch with this offensive line. I'm not sure we'll get these questions answered in training camp. Are the tantalizing sub package future where you get L. Collins if he's the extra tackle on the field, and if he's not healthy, we won't see it. But the extra tackle thing being L. Collins versus the extra tackle being Jackson Carman is also a fun idea to think about. But that's probably a little bit more into the future. Let's get back to some training camp related questions. And maybe it's running back depth. This is something that we talked about with the Joe Mixon topic as well. There's some other questions as far as depth on the offense we can get into as well. We'll get into some of those coming up next.
Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel is a one-stop shop for all things sports wagering. And you can take your first swing at betting on Major League Baseball on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. So if you bet $20, you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend on everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run. Hopefully it's the Reds and they get their offense back in gear because they've scored about 3 runs in the past 52 innings. And you can wager on all of those things at fanduel.com/lockedon. All on an app that's safe, secure, super easy to use, and you get paid instantly. So sign up today at fanduel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's fanduel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball.
Some of the difficult questions facing the Cincinnati Bengals on the offensive side of the ball in training camp this year have to do with depth at a variety of positions and figuring out who's going to make this 53-man roster. But interesting as well is something that came up with that Joe Mixon conversation with the Joe Mixon reworked contract is who steps up at running back and how does that platoon work out? We talked about this a lot actually yesterday, James, but the question really is who will step up and be the Samaje Perine of this offense? And is it 2 guys at times? Is it somebody runs away with the job in the preseason and training camp?
Do you give Joe Mixon a shot at this, at pass blocking more? Like, do you think that that's even a discussion?
My question to answer your question would be, how do you pilot that? Because typically you would try to work that out a little bit in the preseason, right? And are you asking Joe Mixon to go out there and play extra snaps in the preseason if you're not really playing the starters to see if he
Nope.
can pass block? So if that's the case, how do you try to figure it out? I mean,
You
you can
do
do
it
some of
during
it
that
in
joint
camp.
practice, I guess, right?
Yeah. I
The
just
one.
I just don't know if that's enough. I don't know. That's tough. I don't think we have enough information to make that call. If the coaches can see enough that they feel confident, sure, but Mixon probably is what he is at this point, right? Which is a plus runner when he's on, a good receiver, and physically capable of blocking, but just seems like the mistakes have been there consistently every year.
Yeah, I think in an ideal world, he would do that because I think Chase Brown can give you the running portion. Like, I don't question that. I think if you had to hand it off to Chase Brown 10 times tomorrow, he'd be fine. And they don't run the ball a ton. And so I wish that it was that simple. And yet I think it's unlikely that Mixon takes over that role. And so to your point, is it a couple of guys? I think Travion Williams has the lead going into camp, but could Chase Brown overtake him? I think Chris Evans could certainly get in the mix if he shows some growth. So it's a true competition. And I think that the running back by committee is going to be more of a committee this year. And so we'll see. But yeah, it is a big question because they throw the ball a lot. Spoiler. And so pass blocking, even if it's, however many snaps, that matters because those snaps could be the difference because it might happen on 3rd and 8 or 3rd and 15 or key downs in these games. And we know they go down to the wire with these really good teams. We've seen it in the back-to-back years.
And that, Mixon was obviously hurt last year, but the snap split between Samaje Perine and Joe Mixon was 713 for Mixon to 556 for Perine. And Mixon missed a couple games, 2.5 games or so. And that's part of it. And that includes the playoffs, I think, where in the playoffs, Perine was out snapping Mixon. At least against Kansas City, he only had 8 fewer snaps against Buffalo, and he outsnapped him against Baltimore too. So it got to the point late in the year and in the playoffs where Perine was actually getting a little bit more run than Mixon. So these are significant snaps that the Bengals need to figure out how to replace. Mixon will be part of that. I think Mixon will be on the, he might end up taking 5 more snaps a game where maybe they would have had Perine on instead, assuming he's healthy, right? Because part of it is Mixon staying healthy. But outside of that, those pass blocking snaps are paramount for this offense. And you look at the splits for those guys, they actually had a pretty equal amount of run block or of pass blocking snaps last year. So if it's only 66 pass blocking snaps you need to replace for Samaje Perine, and you're going to have Joe Mixon do the 64 roughly, and that was the split they had last year. Well, that's 66 pass blocking snaps that are going to be important that these running backs are going to have to pick up who haven't had a ton of opportunities or any opportunities to do so in the NFL so far.
Yeah, I think the other thing with this offense, just going back to OTAs that I'm going to be looking for in camp, how much play action are we seeing? Clearly, that's something that was a theme. They would have to me, figure out this running back issue, who's the pass blocking back, all of those things. Certainly, if you're going to go that route and use more play action and rely on that and trust that. So that's the other like wrinkle that's tied together to the offensive line to tie really all the questions about the offense going into camp. I think we know what a lot of these guys are, but how much do they implement this play action game? I think overall they're going to be what they are, but that would be nice if they could do that a bit more. We had Brian Callahan on last month and he talked about that. So was it last month? Time flies, but yeah. So I think so. That's something that I'll keep an eye on too. Just looking at different questions, play action, ... question mark. How much? And will it be a career high for Joe Burrow? Because obviously they haven't done much in recent years.
Yeah, when we start to talk about the offense in more detail, that's certainly a big question. I think a bunch of sub-package stuff is a big question. How are they deploying formations is a question that we'll talk about. One, and I don't know if Mike and Lindsay talked about it, but I sent a question into the Always Game Day in Cincinnati mailbag last week. How many snaps does Jamar Chase take in the backfield this year compared to last year? Is it more or less? Do you see more creative deployment of Jamar Chase in terms of alignment? And do the rookies, Charlie Jones and Andre Yosevach, enable any of that? Or are they part of that conversation? And I think when you look at depth on offense, as far as questions that we'll talk about more, and we're going to do these episodes this week, assuming no other major news breaks. You look at the wide receiver depth. You look at the end of the offensive line room. You look at figuring out tight end depth. And these depth questions are going to be pretty critical, I think, as well for this team to answer as the season or as the preseason, as training camp goes on. But the defense has questions too, James. And we should talk about some of those questions that will need answers, because you can talk about them at pretty much every position group. I think linebacker is one where I have the fewest questions. We'll see if we can come up with any questions for that linebacker group, but a couple of critical questions on defense and a punter battle question mark. Maybe we can talk about some of those questions to finish up the show here coming up next.
All right, Jake, let's dive into the defense. And there are some questions for sure. I think the biggest one for most people is the secondary, and specifically safety. That safety room looks a lot different this year with Dax Hill, Nick Scott set to be starters, Jordan Battle, Tyson Anderson, probably your 3-4 in some order, and Mike Thomas behind them. I mean, I have some questions just to see how they deploy these guys. I don't think it's going to be a bad room, though. And I think if this is their main weakness on defense, that they're going to be pretty darn good again. And so I think they're athletic, versatile, and it gives Lou Anarumo a little more of a chance to be the mad scientist that he is at times. Not that they won't give up big plays. They're young guys overall, so they'll give up some big plays, especially early in the season. Would not shock me. Teams are going to test them early. But I think they're going to be pretty good. Like, I don't think they're going to be a below average safety room. My expectation is average or better, which might not be fair, but I think it is reasonable when you look at the talent in that room.
Yeah, there's plenty of athleticism and plenty of intelligence, right? And it's just a matter of experience. And that's where you worry about, are there some bumps in the road on the way? Because I think that Dax Hill was drafted where he was drafted for a reason, right? Nick Scott has started in the NFL, but neither of those guys have had the responsibility that Jesse Bates and Von Bell had in this defense scheme specifically for a full season. And so how does that communication come along where Von Bell was doing a lot of communication in that secondary? How do you replace Jesse Bates, who is consensus a top 10 safety in the NFL? Maybe it's not a bad unit. I don't think that they're, I think that some of the weaknesses is a little bit overstated by some of the national pundits out there, but maybe you and I, but maybe Bengals analysts in general are understating it. So maybe it's somewhere in the middle, right, of those two things where there will be some bumps in the road potentially. We don't know what kind of communication development will happen or how that process will go. You hope that it's just smooth and you hit the ground running and these guys get the system because everyone else around them has been in the system. It's really, these are the two new pieces. But outside of safety, I also see people in the national media questioning Cam Taylor-Britt quite a bit, questioning the secondary in general. And if Chidobe Awuzie is on track for his recovery the way that we think he is, and he's ready to hit the ground running, maybe it's not immediately in training camp, but pretty quick in training camp, and Cam Taylor-Britt continues his ascension because it was steady. It wasn't like a major roller coaster ride for Cam Taylor-Britt. As he got more experience, he played better. Pretty much linearly throughout the season. Like, there weren't major dips in his play. There's maybe one or two bad games or tougher games for him down the stretch, but he showed up and made big plays consistently and more consistently as the season went on. And Mike Hilton, of course, is back in the nickel. On top of that, I feel better about their depth in the secondary this year. So I think that in general, this secondary doom saying that you've seen a little bit or questioning that you're seeing where this is a weakness, I think SI just did their feature on the Bengals, their national feature, 32 teams in 32 days, and they said that the secondary is the biggest question. And maybe that's true, but I'm not really questioning the corners. I think it is really, how does the safety stuff work out? Do we see more 3 safety stuff? Is there an adaptation period there for that last level of this defense in the safeties? Because I feel pretty good about the corners and better about their depth at corner this year too, if Cheeto comes back and hits the ground running like we expect he will.
Yeah. Cheeto, if healthy, the third best corner in the division, second. I mean, Denzel Ward, no one in Pittsburgh. Marlon Humphrey, maybe. I would probably take a healthy Cheeto over him. You could. Who else?
I think you could argue Denzel Ward too, and how those guys stack up.
Denzel's the best guy. He's the best.
Well, I think that's an argument based on down performance.
I would be shocked, but fine. But okay, well then that's just another testament, though, right, of where he's at. Yeah. And I think contract year, I expect him. You want to talk about the expectations? I just had pretty high expectations for the safeties and these young guys. I expect Cheeto to play like it's 2021, but better, because he's been tested as that number one corner. And it may take a few weeks. Like, I'm not saying he's going to come back off the ACL and just be Cheeto, but he looks so good and fluid and was moving great. It's a contract year. He's playing for that last big deal. And obviously you have the Super Bowl implications, all those things. Like, I think Cheeto's going to be really good. And I would expect him to be ready early in the season and look like himself. I would say by midseason, playing at a dominant level where maybe he gets beat some early in the year And then by November, we look up, let's say December, and we're like, man, the whole month of November, Cheetah was much better. And going into the postseason, he plays that dominant role again. That's what I expect from him. And he played at a high level during their playoff run, the interception in the Super Bowl. And obviously losing him last year was a big reason why they weren't able to make it back.
Well, and he was playing so well last year. He was playing at such a high level before the injury. And what was crazy about it is they didn't really seem to miss a beat with Eli Apple stepping in, Cam Taylor-Britt stepping in, and that secondary continued to play well. How much of that was what the safeties were able to cover up? Do the corners need to play better this year with not having Jesse Bates back there, without having Von Bell helping to sort things out back there? Miscommunication is something that I think you're going to have to be aware of, and how does this team make sure that they're staying on the same page in that Lou Anarumo defense, and that's something that they can work out through training camp. But also, I think it will be interesting to see what kind of sub packages Lou Anarumo cooks up, and we'll get into this a little bit more when we talk about the defense as well. But their first 3 draft picks, again, on the defensive side of the ball, how and when do these guys get onto the field? How do they fare in training camp? Does Jordan Battle force himself onto the field a little bit more? Does Miles Murphy say, you know what, I'm ready to go out there and play 600 snaps this year. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to play a starter size role for this team. And maybe he's not starting over Hendrickson or Hubbard, but maybe he's forcing his way onto the field. And that's something that starts in training camp as well. Maybe that's in the form of some sub packages again, where he's out there with Hendrickson and Hubbard and maybe Joseph Osai or maybe Cam Sample in certain packages and that sort of thing. And so the rookies and how they're performing early, DJ Turner, how he's looking as he's going to get to go against some of these really great receivers are certainly some things that I think are very interesting, because part of the Bengals strategy this year, I think, is drafting for the future on defense, where you have these expiring contracts. But another part of it is, if you're spending your first 3 picks there and you feel like you got really good value in DJ Turner and Jordan Battle, which they do, are they going to force themselves onto the field as well?
Yeah, I think Turner's the one where it almost feels like the toughest path, because you play so many different defensive ends and I, maybe he kicks inside some, maybe you move Sam Hubbard inside. Like, I could see the path where Murphy's just such a freak athlete that he can do that. But if Cheeto's healthy, Turner's really battling who? Like Sidney Jones for snaps as that 4th corner. I think that's kind of where you're looking, and maybe he beats him out, but Jones is no slouch now. And so I think that he's got the toughest path. Battle, he may be the 3rd safety, may end up being the 4th. I'm not counting out Tyson Anderson, but they certainly are impressed with Battle. And so we'll see there. But yeah, those are like almost fringe questions, but they're bigger questions because of where you pick these guys. And it does feel like that most of them will be depth pieces initially. But if they do show up and play at a high level early on, they could force their hand a little bit, because it's not like last year where you have all these veterans in the secondary where DJ Turner can't force Lou Anarumo's hand a little bit. Like last year, Dax had a really good preseason. He was not playing and taking snaps from Von Bell or Jesse Bates. It was just not happening. So it is a little bit different this year, I think, for Battle and certainly for Turner.
Yeah, and I think that we're scraping for questions too. Like, most of this defense is the same. And that's why we spent so much time on the secondary, where there are changes. And some of the questions that we have on the defensive side of the ball aren't questions that you can answer in training camp. Like, interior pass rush is not a question that we're really going to answer in training camp. We'll keep our eyes on Zach Carter for sure. Like, if he's out there making splash plays, as far as splash plays go for interior defensive linemen, and as far as you can evaluate that in training camp, especially before pads come on, which is to say not at all. So when pads come on, that is something that we'll get some inclination about. We'll have an idea of what way that might go, but you really don't know with these guys until preseason games start happening, and until regular season games start happening. Sure. Really, for stuff like interior pass rush, which is, I think, a question, because DJ Reader is great, and he was our best interior pass rusher last year, as a guy who, he wasn't playing a bunch of zero tech last year. He wasn't playing a bunch of nose tackle, but he's playing a lot of 2 gap responsibility stuff, or 1.5 gaps at least in this defense. And so Can they get a little bit more out of one of these guys on the interior from a pass rush perspective, or is that a place where we start to see Myles Murphy aligning? Like these sub packages are something that we can watch in training camp, and do they roll out the 4 defensive end, defensive line essentially in training camp? Do we see
I
some
hope so.
stuff like that? Do we see the 3 safety packages in training camp? These are that's why D sub packages is a note if you're watching on YouTube, is a bullet point in the On Today's show, because those are questions that I think we can actually observe and answer in training camp. And I don't think we're going to have time today, James, to hit Brad Robbins and Drew Sample, although that is certainly a question that I think will be answered in training camp, maybe early
Perfect.
in training
I was
camp.
letting that marinate as much as possible, so you had time to correct yourself. If Drew Sample is battling Brad Robbins, there's a problem, because Brad Robbins should kick his tail.
It is a question that I think will be answered pretty clearly, and they don't have to make a decision early.
You still didn't catch it. You said Drew Sample, man, not Chrisman.
Oh, I said Sample.
And then I said it, and you still didn't catch it.
No. Locked in.
my
I'm
goodness.
like looking at the name too.
Yeah, Drew Chrisman.
We're in regular season form here, James.
Let's
Me
go.
making errors on names, that's normal business here on the Locked On Bengals podcast.
So yeah, if Drew Sample is pushing Brad Robbins, there's a problem.
Yeah. Drew Chrisman and Brad Robbins.
We'll get to it though. Special teams matters.
It does matter. It does matter.
Will Money Mac bounce back?
I don't think we're going to get that answer in training camp, but
I'll give you the answer right now.
You're very confident in Evan McPherson.
Yeah, you already knew the answer.
Yeah.
So why even ask the question?
We will get into these both sides of the ball, offense, defense, a little bit on special teams in more depth this week, because a lot of these fringe roster battles I think are very interesting, and we don't have those conversations. We haven't had those conversations yet, and so getting into some of the roster battles and where some of these most interesting roster battles are going to be on both sides of the ball are going to be very interesting, and some of the dark horses on both sides of the ball and who we think might emerge as sneaky roster candidates, sneaky pushing for playing time candidates. I think those will be interesting conversations as well, and we'll continue to do that this week. And we're also expecting some news on the Bengals Ring of Honor sometime this week as well, which will spur some conversation as well. So we'll have all that coming this week. Training camp, like I said, right around the corner, and we're just going to keep ramping up for it, James. And thanks for listening to this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. And until next time, Hoo day, and have a good one.